What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Nabeel Qureshi trying to prove historical facts about Jesus and his resurrection. I feel like these two ideas should be handled on their own. What historical facts do we know about Jesus and how do we know them? And then separately from that, did a man named Jesus resurrect from the dead? Obviously, with me being a mythicist, I don't think that there are historical facts about a man named Jesus that started Christianity. But if there were a man named Jesus, what are the most historical things that we could say about him? Turns out, not that much. Then, completely separate from the historical version of Jesus, we have the question of whether or not this Jesus resurrected from the dead. For that discussion, you can definitely just automatically assume that Jesus did exist in history with the most minimal amount of facts attributed to him. But even then, though, it doesn't mean that Jesus definitely resurrected from the dead. If you want to fuck around and find out how thin the evidence is for Jesus and his resurrection, then please stay tuned.
What are the sources regarding Christianity? And some of you might be even asking, Nabeel, why should I even believe Jesus is real? Why should I ever even believe that he's a man who existed? The first thing I'm going to start off by telling you is that it is incontrovertible according to the historical principles of investigation that a man named Jesus existed in the first century. How do we know this?
New Testament Studies uses its own special version of the historical method in order to prove this. It deviates from the normal historical method when they do things like cite the criterion of embarrassment, or when they present ad hoc explanations for why the Gospels are reliable history, like, inventing documents that we've never known to exist. They do the same thing to argue for a traditional view of Gospel authorship. They fabricate ad hoc sources that attest to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John writing their respective Gospels. They also deviate from the normal historical method when they disregard evidence, like in the Pauline Creed, when Paul only ever cites Scripture and Revelation as the only ways that he knows of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So, is Jesus and his resurrection incontrovertible? Sure. To Christian scholars who are only looking to historically validate their faith. And keep in mind that this is the majority of the New Testament scholarly community. This community does love their token skeptics, but they are sure to keep everybody towing the bare minimum Christian line. The fact is that the evidence for not only Jesus' resurrection, but also his very existence is very thin. If Jesus did exist in history, given the evidence that we currently have, we can't know anything about him. All supposed facts are ad hoc speculations made from dubious conclusions about the evidence.
We have over 40 records of Jesus' life from ancient times, describing this man who is essentially a carpenter in Palestine.
No, we don't. With historical sources, what we want are independent textual evidence. This would be independent of any fabricated information about our subject. But also, we hope to have some kind of first-hand eyewitness account of the events happening. Whether that be reported through somebody else recording the eyewitness account, or copying from the eyewitness account, or it being an eyewitness account itself. The best account written about Alexander the Great was written 500 years after he died. The reason it's considered the best biography about Alexander is because its author, Arian, used first-hand eyewitness evidence. The best that we have for Jesus, his death, and his resurrection is Paul's account. Paul didn't see or meet Jesus while he was supposedly walking around on earth. His information didn't come from any human person. This information was only revealed to Paul after Jesus supposedly died and resurrected by Jesus himself. Does this sound like good evidence to you? Something tells me that Nabeel is overstating the evidence that we have for Jesus.
He didn't have much of anything. He wasn't a centrally important figure at the time, yet we have 40 sources that refer to him. You know who the emperor was at Jesus' time? Someone shout it out. Tiberius. Good. Tiberius was the emperor of Rome at that time. Now, this is a man who obviously we should have a lot written about. We can expect tons and tons of records about this man, can't we? The historical records contain Tiberius' name by 10 different individuals. That's it. 10 for Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, 40 for Jesus. You can see we have excellent reason to believe that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and existed in the first century.
I feel like this is a good time to stress how you should fact check any claim made by any apologist, like Nabeel here, because his comparison is ass backwards. There are actually 43 references to Tiberius and no first-hand account references to Jesus in the first 150 years after he supposedly lived. I'll have a blog link down below from Matthew Ferguson, who in detail goes over how wrong Nabeel is here. But ultimately, this particular slogan that he's using just clues us into the fact that he's being spoon-fed this information from Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. They coined this slogan back in 2012, and as soon as they started saying it, it was demonstrated to be false. The only indication that we get that Tiberius was the emperor of Rome during Jesus' supposed time on earth comes from Luke's gospel. Matthew's gospel actually has Jesus' birth taking place 10 years prior to Luke's gospel. Apologists have to literally move historical facts around in order to harmonize these two accounts. And this is the apologist's historical method in a nutshell. Misrepresent the information as long as it's being used to prove biblical reliability. In this context, I only fault Nabeel for not doing his due diligence and checking this information that confirms his bias. I blame Mike Licona and Gary Habermas for both misrepresenting the information.
That's why very, very few, in fact, I could probably count it on one hand, actually, I know of two, scholars who study the historical Jesus actually claim that Jesus never existed, and one of them is Bob Price, who most other scholars say is just not even possible what he says. So we can dismiss, just due to the reasoning and due to the lack of scholastic support, that this is actually the case. So Jesus certainly exists.
Now, not a fan of Dr. Price or some of his pop-level work. I've found that he speculates a lot and he builds a lot of his conclusions off of shaky evidence. But that's the big difference between Nabeel's dismissal and my dismissal of some of Dr. Price's conclusions and claims. I have actual reasons to dismiss what I disagree with. Nabeel seems to only appeal to authority to dismiss his claims. I want to emphasize that you should have good reasons for dismissing a conclusion or claim. Just saying, nah-uh, isn't a good reason. Critically thinking your way through why you dismiss those claims and conclusions is the best way to go. And just so you know, since Nabeel gave this talk, 2 peer-reviewed books have been published that academically support the mythicist position. My guess is that this won't affect Nabeel's feelings about the historical Jesus. Regardless of that, there is scholastic support for this position, despite what Nabeel is saying in this video.
So, okay, what can we know about him? Well, of the scholars that study him, and keep in mind, there is an entire area of historical studies called historical Jesus studies. So we have scholars who've been studying this on all sides. These aren't all Christians by any means. Actually, the most influential ones wouldn't align themselves with Orthodox Christianity. You have people like Paula Fredrickson, Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman. You have people along these lines who would say, like John Dominic Crossan, who would say that of Jesus we can know for a fact that he died on the cross.
Okay, so an argument from authority then. You know, a lot of people misunderstand what the argument from authority is. If your only reason for accepting some conclusion is because an authority says that it's true, then that is an argument from authority. Generally, the authority should have good reasons for coming to the conclusions that they do, but in this particular case, they don't. And I'm not just talking about the historical Jesus, mind you, I'm also talking about the resurrection question. The majority opinion on scholars working in this particular field would agree that Jesus resurrected from the dead as well as existed. But when we take a look at the actual evidence that these conclusions are based on, we'll find that it's built on very shaky ground. As I said before, they have skeptics that play their game, and so they're tolerated by the New Testament scholarly community. But just because a bunch of people, whether they be experts or not, agree about some conclusion, that doesn't mean that they are correct. It's the evidence that should point us in the direction of their conclusion, not their opinions.
Now keep in mind, that's one of our 3 points that we're proving for Christianity, or attempting to show to determine its reliability. Did Jesus die on the cross? The scholars who study his life, regardless of whether they're atheist, Buddhist, agnostic, Hindu, Christian, it doesn't matter. They all conclude that Jesus died on the cross. Now, if I left it there, it would be an appeal to authority, and we're trying to be academically rigorous tonight, so I'm not going to do that.
Oh, good! So there's going to be some kind of evidence for this. Can't wait for that. Also, I'd love for him to name a Buddhist or Hindu New Testament scholar. The majority of New Testament scholars are going to be Christian in one denomination or another. Like I said before, they do have their token skeptics, and they do have some people that are not Christian that are New Testament scholars, but still, regardless of all that though, I can't wait for this evidence.
I'm going to give you some of their reasons why they believe Jesus died on the cross, but we're going to keep it brief because scholars are unanimous on this issue. By the way, it's not just them. Even Muslim scholars will argue that Jesus did die on the cross. How many of you heard of Reza Aslan's book recently, Zealots, that came out this year? A few of you? Reza Aslan's a scholar who has studied the historical Jesus. And as a Muslim, he says, yes, Islam denies Jesus' death on the cross, and I am a Muslim, but I confirm that Jesus' death on the cross is historically certain. In fact, he builds his whole book off the fact that Jesus died on the cross. So even as a Muslim, he says Jesus died on the cross.
Well, Reza is kind of an outlier as a Muslim who believes that Jesus died on the cross. Nabeel is trying to use the fact that Reza, being a Muslim, also believing that Jesus died on the cross as some way to reinforce how true it is that Jesus really did die on the cross. This shouldn't be convincing to anyone, and I don't care what Reza believes. I care about what the evidence shows, and the evidence for Jesus being crucified at all is non-existent. We have Paul that claims that Jesus died on the cross, but he has scriptural reasons for thinking that way. There was a belief that the Messiah would suffer a shameful death. Also in the scriptures, there's this notion that being hung on a tree or being crucified was accursed by God, or they were put under God's curse. It was considered to be a shameful kind of death. With Paul being a very knowledgeable Jew, the notion that Paul could have put these puzzle pieces together is highly plausible. Add to that fact, Paul directly says that he only got his information about Jesus, including his death on the cross, from Revelation and Scripture. So the most parsimonious explanation here is that early Jewish Christians would have derived this notion that the Messiah died on a cross from pre-existing Jewish theology. So Paul doesn't help us, and he is the only independent information that we actually have. So Paul doesn't help us, and he's the only source of independent information that we have. So to summarize the evidence that we have for the crucifixion of Jesus is Paul claiming that he died on the cross, then other people repeating Paul's claim, or rather early Jewish Christian claims, and that's it. There's no other evidence that indicates that Jesus died on the cross. All other references to it come far after the early Jewish Christians would have influenced Paul, and everybody else was repeating Paul's words, or at least the gospel that Paul had that he got from Scripture and Revelation.
So why? Why do they say this? Well, because first off, all the evidence that we have, all the records of Jesus' life, which talk about his death, indicate that he did die. If they say anything, it says that he did die on the cross under Pontius Pilate, which is why Paula Fredrickson says, if there's anything we can know about Jesus, anything at all, it's this, that he died on the cross under Pontius Pilate.
Well, Paul doesn't talk about who crucified Jesus. All he really gives us is this ambiguous phrase, rulers of this age, which a lot of historicists like to say that's just Paul's way of referencing the Romans. But if that were the case, why wouldn't Paul just say the Romans did it? Another thing to factor in is Paul's theology. Paul considered Satan to be the ruler of this age or of this world. He even uses the same Greek words to describe both the people that killed Jesus as well as Satan. Paul considered Satan to be the ruler of this world or of this age. He even uses the same Greek words to describe both whoever killed Jesus and Satan. So in light of Paul's theology, I feel like the most parsimonious conclusion that we can come to is that Paul believed that Satan and his demons crucified Jesus. And Paul certainly never mentions the name Pilate at all, especially not connected with Jesus' death. I'm really only focusing on Paul at this point because we've already shown that he's the only piece of independent information we have about Jesus. Considering that, it seems like this idea that Pilate is the one that crucified Jesus was invented with the Gospels. And we don't know what is historically true or fabricated in the Gospels. Now, the Gospels were probably informed by oral traditions or maybe some written traditions that we just don't have access to now. But what that means is that we can't analyze these sources to know if they contained eyewitness accounts. Given that, there's no good way to distinguish between fabricated information and true historical information. Now, we do have strong textual evidence that links Paul's epistles and Mark's gospel. So the gospels are not independent of Paul. They actually rely on Paul and the scriptures. Since we don't have any other citations or indications of other referenced work, this is what we're left with.
If you go away from Christian records, you go to Jewish records like Josephus, we can also see in the first century that non-Christians are saying Jesus died on the cross. We go to Gentile scholars, they are also agreeing that Jesus died on the cross. And in fact, we also have some of them saying that these people believe he is risen from the dead. We'll get to that in just a moment.
All of those sources are based on the gospel accounts. Josephus' Testimonium Flavianum is sometimes said to be only slightly interpolated, but we don't actually have any evidence to suggest this. What we do have a lot of evidence for is a Christian right around the 3rd century inserting this information into Josephus' work. So all of these Gentile sources that he's talking about here only repeat the claims of the Gospels and of Paul's epistles. And those accounts aren't based on eyewitness testimony. Those are just the claims about Jesus.
So we have excellent reason to believe Jesus died on the cross because all the records point to that. Plus, if you study the historical process of crucifixion, nobody ever in the entire history of the Roman process of crucifixion, no one ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. So we have excellent reason to believe Jesus died on the cross.
Yes, if Jesus was crucified, then he probably died on the cross. We just don't have any evidence that establishes this event, other than tradition based on the hallucinations and scriptural interpretations of Paul. This is not how the historical method works.
Did he rise from the dead? This is an important matter, and lots of historians say we cannot investigate the resurrection because that's not a historical matter, that's a supernatural matter, and you can't study supernatural matters.
For this section, I'm perfectly fine assuming that Jesus existed and he died on the cross. The argument surrounding Jesus' resurrection isn't really concerned about the earthly presence of Jesus. Even on the celestial model for Jesus, he's still resurrected, so obviously whether or not that was on earth or in the heavens, it didn't matter. I also agree with historians that say a resurrection is a supernatural event and the historical method can't validate a supernatural event.
Well, that's jumping the gun just a bit. If every explanation that is naturalistic falls short and falls very short of explaining what happened, then we have reason to believe that something supernatural may have happened. If there simply is no good explanation, naturalistically speaking, we can use a historical process of investigation to conclude that quite likely maybe something supernatural happened here.
This pivot on the resurrection is hilarious. First, Nabeel spends minutes in this section discussing the overwhelming consensus for not only Jesus' existence, but his crucifixion. Even in his evidence, he attests to how overwhelming the consensus is. As soon as the scholarly consensus turns against him, he's like, whoa, wait a minute. We're not just going to sit here and listen to what all these historians have to say about this, are we? He attempts to save his case by stating that the naturalistic explanations fall short in their explanatory power. That's simply not the case, because any naturalistic explanation, however unlikely it is going to be far more likely than a supernatural explanation, like magical Jew resurrection.
So what happened when Jesus died? Shortly after his death, we take a look at what happened, and those historical scholars we've already referred to, in general, agree with 3 facts that are considered relatively incontrovertible. And I'm giving you what's called the minimal facts argument, if you want to look into this. It's called the minimal facts argument, primarily promoted by a man named Gary Habermas, who's written a book called The Historical Jesus. Also by his protege, Michael Licona, who's written a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. He wrote it alongside Gary Habermas. And he's also written his manifesto, a rather large book that serves well for curing insomnia. He's written that as well. Sorry, Mike. He's written that as well. And if you want to look at a very thorough investigation of the historical method on whether or not Jesus died, I suggest you take a look at this book published by Erdman's. Michael Licona is the author.
Oh, wait. First, Nabeel hails the scholarly consensus about Jesus' existence and his crucifixion. And then when the historians turn against him, he shies away from it and he casts some doubt on the consensus of these historians. And now we're back to the consensus of historians? This feels like a roller coaster here. I mean, come on, Nabeel. Are we supposed to trust the authorities or are we not? At this point, it just seems like blatant cherry picking. Also, he finally name drops the sources that we picked up on at the very beginning of the video. It's amazing how Nabeel shrinks the minimal facts argument down to just 3 facts. Of course, at this time, Gary Habermas usually employs a different number of facts depending on the audience that he's talking to. It could range between 6 and 12 minimal facts. Put plain and simply, the minimal facts argument just fails to establish that a supernatural event happened. All the minimal facts do is just establish that the belief that Jesus resurrected from the dead started in the 1st century.
The argument runs as follows. Pretty much every scholar who studies this, at least a vast majority, if not virtually all scholars, conclude 3 things happened after Jesus died. Well, number 1, the first one is that Jesus did die on the cross, which we just looked at. Number 2, that the disciples, Jesus' disciples, all believed he had risen from the dead. So, the disciples truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and according to most historical Jesus scholarship, Christianity wouldn't have gotten off the ground if it weren't for that fact.
Yeah, they sincerely believed it happened. That doesn't mean that it actually happened. They just sincerely believed it. This doesn't establish anything other than some Jewish Christians believed some shit in the 1st century. There was a lot of that going around at the time.
Fact number 3. Fact number 1 was Jesus died on the cross. Fact number 2, the disciples truly believed he had risen from the dead. Fact number 3, people who were enemies of Jesus, or not his disciples, also believed he had risen from the dead. Now, who are we talking about? We're talking specifically about 2 people, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, as it were.
People converting to a belief isn't proof that the belief is true. You need evidence to establish that some event actually happened. And this isn't evidence. At best, you could say that people were convinced of a belief, but there are also people that think that the world is flat. Does that mean that the world is flat now? No. It doesn't. So just because some people switch sides, come over to Christianity, that doesn't mean that Christianity is now true.
James, the brother of Jesus, did not follow Jesus during his lifetime. We see in the book of Mark that Jesus' family comes up and says to people around Jesus that he is out of his mind, basically, that he's crazy, which is what leads Jesus to say, "Who is my mother and brother and sister?" It's those who do the will of God. So Jesus' family is not on his side. It wasn't until after the resurrection, or supposedly the resurrection, when all of a sudden the disciple James becomes the brother of Jesus, James, becomes a leader of the Christian church.
Okay, first off, he's conflating James the pillar with James the supposed brother. But for the sake of argument, let's just say that there was some dude named James going around claiming to be the brother of Jesus. That doesn't mean that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Like I said before, the accounts in the Gospels are not historically reliable, and we can't determine between historical truth and fabrication. There is a narrative reason for Jesus' reaction to his family considering him to go crazy. The first rule of the Gospels is that the Jews are idiots. That's how the Gospels portrayed them. Next, the section of the Gospels proclaiming that all of those that do the will of God are Jesus' brothers and sisters are pushing a theological concept adhered to by Paul, that all baptized Christians were brothers and sisters of Christ. Regardless of all that though, someone claiming to be Jesus' brother finally pulling the stick out of his ass and believing his brother doesn't prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead.
And also Saul of Tarsus. Who is this Saul guy? Saul was the student of Gamaliel, one of the chief leaders of the Jews in the time. This man was primed and groomed to be a leader of Jews, a leader of Pharisees. He was going to have all kinds of power in the temple. He already had all kinds of power because he was able to deliver people to prison. He was given special permission to hunt Christians down. Yet this man was willing to go to his death over and over and over again for something. For what? He claims it was because he has seen the risen Jesus.
Okay. He had a sincere belief that Jesus resurrected from the dead. That's all. Like we've already pointed out in this video, sincere belief doesn't always indicate true belief. Just because Paul became convinced for emotional reasons, that doesn't mean that his belief is true to reality.
The earliest records of Jesus' resurrection say that 500 people saw him risen at the same time.
This comes from the Pauline Creed, and it's just a claim. You could say that 1,000 people saw the resurrected Jesus, but that doesn't actually mean that Jesus resurrected. This would prove that a lot of people sincerely believed they experienced the risen Jesus, but it doesn't prove that it actually happened. Also, as I've mentioned in other videos, this could be an interpolation. Paul could have originally said that Jesus just appeared over the Pentecost rather than to 500 people. This is due to a common spelling error that could have occurred in this section. Considering the shoddy nature of early Christian scribes, it's plausible that this could have happened. Regardless of that, this doesn't mean that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead. I was thoroughly unimpressed with Nabeel's apologetic attempt to salvage Jesus and his resurrection. He uses a subset of Gary Habermas's minimal facts in order to establish that Jesus resurrected, and he mainly appeals to the consensus for Jesus' very existence. I think that the argument about Jesus' existence is completely separate from this idea that he resurrected. You can definitely assume that Jesus existed and was crucified in order to have a debate or a discussion on the resurrection of Jesus. But keep in mind that both Jesus' existence and his resurrection have the same kind, quality, and quantity of evidence, being that it's only revelatory experiences and scriptural references that clue our earliest sources in to either of these topics. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today for a look at Nabeel Qureshi's attempt to save Jesus' historicity and his resurrection. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about Nabeel's attempt. Do you think that he has something here, or do you think that he needs to go back to the drawing board? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like videos like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.